friends, welcome to part 2 of our brain videos. So like I said before, we're going to be talking about the cerebral cortex in this video. This is the part of the human brain that sets us apart from all of other species. So let's talk about the difference between the cerebral cortex versus the cerebrum. You're going to see them both kind of interchangeably, but they are two different parts, so let's break them down. Cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the cerebrum and the most prominent part of the brain. So it's a thin outer layer that goes over the cerebrum. And the cerebral cortex is made up of a gray matter that covers the inner white matter of the cerebrum. So the gray matter is more prominent, it does more things, it's more higher functioning, while the white matter of the cerebrum is more filling. And the cerebral cortex is responsible for most of the sophisticated information processing in the brain. So this is where all of our higher functioning things are going to come into play. So let's look at this diagram here. These are the parts that we're going to be talking about and discussing when we are talking about the cerebral cortex. We have our frontal lobe. We have our motor cortex and our sensory cortex. You see that it says somato in front of both of those. That just, soma means body, right? So it's just like body motor cortex, body sensory cortex. A lot of times you're just going to see them as motor and sensory, but if you do see somatosensory, know that it's the same thing. We have our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe, our cerebellum. That's obviously not part of our cerebral cortex, but it's here on the visual to just show you where the placement of it is. Spinal cord, medulla, that's also part of the brain stem we learned from the last video. And then the temporal lobe. So our 4 different lobes, plus our motor and sensory cortexes, those are going to be kind of the main places that we're looking at. So let's break it down. Let's talk about the frontal lobe first. So you can also hear it called prefrontal cortex, which is talking about the very front part of the frontal lobe. But this controls a lot of different things. So we're controlling judgment, planning, producing speech sounds, controlling our emotions, personality, temperament, and it's going to allow us to have movement. And we see that our motor cortex, it almost looks like a headband that goes across the top of your brain. That is actually going to be in the frontal lobe. So out of the 2 cortexes, the motor cortex is the one that's in the frontal lobe. So that's going to help us with our precise movements. So when they talk about younger individuals, specifically adolescents, and they say that your frontal lobe is not fully developed, that's true, and that shows us why sometimes teenagers don't have the best judgment, don't have the best planning skills. They are not always in control of their emotions. Their limbic system is fully developed, so they're almost having an emotional overload without that sense of judgment to back it up. Now, how do we know all of this stuff from the frontal lobe? So a lot of it is going to come from case studies, specifically this one that's very familiar. You've probably heard of it before. We're going to talk about Phineas Gage. So that's this awesome dude over here to the right. You can see he's got one eye open, one eye closed. You're about to find out why he has one eye closed. So Phineas Gage, he was a great guy. He was respectable. He was polite. He worked on the railroads. And part of his job was to clear paths for new railroads. So we're going to throw in a little bit of history here. Think about the United States in 1846. A lot of the Industrial Revolution is happening, and so a lot of development is happening, specifically the railroad. And so this was a very common job to have to clear pathways for the railroad tracks to do that transcontinental railroad. And so he was in charge of that. Well, there was an accident, so they used a lot of dynamite, and when working with that dynamite, it exploded, and when it exploded, a steel rod went into his brain. So it entered beneath his cheekbone and then went out the top of his brain, so it crossed right through that frontal lobe, permanently damaging it. So you can see kind of in this picture off to the left side where that rod would have gone through. Now, he survived, which was a shock. Most people didn't think he was going to survive, but he came out a completely different person. He didn't have any speech or motor or memory impairment, but like we said, he had a lot of damage to the frontal lobe. And so that affected his personality, his temperament, his judgment, all of the stuff that you saw on the slide before, that was now affected. So he went from being a respectable, polite guy who could hold a job to someone who was very angry, could not control his emotions, could not hold a job, had a lot of seizures. He turned into a completely different person. So what psychology did was they gathered all of this information about his extreme change in behavior and thought, oh my goodness, the frontal lobe controls all of these different things. And so this is a perfect example of how you can use a case study to then gather information that can be relayed to the rest of the public. Now, let's talk about that motor cortex. So we said that's also in the frontal lobe, and it almost looks like a headband that goes across the back of the frontal lobe. So it's located in the back, and it's largely responsible for voluntary movements of the body. So we talked about voluntary is movements that you can control. So there are different parts on the motor cortex that move different parts of your body. So if the part of the cortex for your legs is stimulated, then you'll be able to move your legs. If part of the motor cortex is stimulated for your hands, you'll be able to move your hands. Movements that are precise and delicate are controlled by larger portions on the motor cortex. So the more precise that movement is that you have to do, there's more space for it on the motor cortex as opposed to a movement that is less precise. So let me show you this picture. It's also in the PowerPoint that's on Canvas. You might be thinking, what am I looking at here? Well, you see these two dudes with a lot of disproportionate body parts, right? And the purpose of these is to show you what your body would look like based on the portions of the motor cortex that are related to that body part. So for example, the hands, we use those for a lot of precise movements. And so if it's more precise, then it has more room on the motor cortex. And so in this example of the guy to the right, where it says motor model, that's why his hands are so big, to represent that your hands take up a large part of the motor cortex because they do the most precise movements. So we see the lips. The lips are very large too because your lips have to perform precise movements to create words. You'll see that the legs are really tiny and skinny because a lot of times we're not making really precise movements with our legs. So you see the same thing off to the left for the sensory model. It's the same concept here. So the more sensitive a part of your body is, the more room it has on that sensory cortex. So for example, that's why the hands are more sensitive than the legs. If you hurt something in your hands, it usually hurts more than your legs. Your tongue is pretty sensitive. Think about if you bite your tongue, right? That hurts a lot worse than if someone like punches you in the arm. I guess it depends on how hard someone punches you. But also just think of the areas on your body that are the most sensitive, and they take up the most room on the sensory cortex. Okay, moving to our next lobe, we have our parietal lobe. This is kind of the mystery lobe, but this has the sensory cortex located in it. And you can see that the sensory cortex, it's just like the motor cortex in that it goes across the top of the brain, almost like a headband. But this is now at the front of the parietal lobe. So make sure you know which lobe the motor cortex is in and which lobe the sensory cortex is in. So the parietal lobe is gonna help us with body position, spatial reasoning like touch, pressure, temperature, pain, and then it's home to that sensory cortex. So this is really where your sensations happen. So if someone touches you, you can process that in your parietal lobe. If you feel pressure, if you feel cold, if you feel hot, if your leg hurts or a part of your body hurts, All of that is stimulated in the parietal lobe. So keyword here, I like to think of, it's like the sensation lobe. So let's talk about the sensory cortex here. Like we said, it's located at the front of the parietal lobe, and it's largely responsible for perceiving touch and pressure on parts of the body. So you might not be thinking right now about if you have socks on or not, but as soon as I said, now you're thinking about your socks, you can feel your socks on your feet, right? And so your ability to feel your socks on your feet comes from the sensory cortex. So we see this image off to the right. These are functional MRI images, which show us brain activity, right? We learned that in the last video, of a brain experiencing pain. It says the green indicates sensory experience, since we're talking about the sensory cortex, and the red indicates emotional experiences to pain here. So we see that red it's in the parietal lobe, but it's also kind of right by our limbic system. But then green, that sensory information, we see it's kind of arching over the top of the brain because that sensory cortex, that's it looks like that headband across the top of your head. So this is just a good example to show you like where we sense sensation and where we sense pain. So if a part of the sensory cortex is being stimulated, then that means the person would be able to feel pressure on that corresponding part of the body. So like we said before, the more sensitive the area, the more surface area on that cortex is dedicated to that part of the body. Moving right along to our temporal lobes, let's talk about some of the functions that happen here. So our primary auditory cortex is going to be located in our temporal lobe. So this is where hearing happens. This is what allows you to make sense of what you're hearing. Our storing of long memories happens in our temporal lobes, as well as speech and language. We're going to talk about 2 areas dedicated to those, and our ability to understand. Big one though, make sure you know hearing, all of the hearing processing is going to come from the temporal lobe. Now, occipital lobe, this is in the back lower part of your brain. This is going to control all aspects of your vision. So this is where your primary visual cortex is located. So each part of that visual cortex corresponds with a particular place in the retina, which is that back part of your eye, which we'll talk about in sensation and perception. Receiving only that information from that one place, and then those pieces are later put together to form a whole image, and then your visual cortex allows you to understand and actually process that image that you're seeing. So vision, that's your key word for occipital lobe. That's where your primary visual cortex is located. Now, association area. So these are really important areas, but they're not as important as the different lobes, right? They just get put in a slightly lower category. So uncommitted areas that involve higher mental functioning. So these are really important, but they're just kind of separate from our sensory and our motor functionings. So we have our Wernicke's area. Now let me tell you all the different pronunciations I've heard for this word. I've heard Wernicke's, it's just like how his last name started with a W, but it sounded like a V. I've heard it pronounced the same way here, Wernicke's area. If you hear it different, know that we're talking about the same thing. But this is located in the left hemisphere of your temporal lobe. Make note of that. Left temporal lobe. And this is responsible for language comprehension and expression. So your ability to comprehend language as it's being told to you and understand what they're saying, and for you to put together comprehensive sentences and words that actually make sense. So keyword here, comprehension. Now we have our Broca's area, which is also dealing with speech, but this is dealing with the actual motor movement involved in speech. So your mouth moving, your tongue moving, the actual muscles involved in speech, that's controlled in your Broca's area. So I'll show you 2 videos. one of a guy that has damage to his Broca area and the other one of a woman who has damage to her Wernicke's, and you can see the difference. One of them can't actually form words, while the other one can form words, but they don't make any sense. There's no comprehension happening there. But again, both on the left side. However, Broca's area is the left frontal lobe, and the Wernicke's area is the left temporal lobe. So let's think about this. Considering specific functions of both Wernicke's and Broca's, why do their locations make sense? Why for the Broca's area, which is the actual movement of the lips, why is that in the frontal lobe? And the Wernicke's is in the temporal lobe. Think about that, and we'll talk about that the next time I see you when we discuss this video. Okay, how many hemispheres do you have in your brain? You have 2, and they're roughly mirror images of each other. They're very symmetrical. They're the same shape. However, we're going to see that they do 2 different things. So both of your hemispheres can potentially function as 2 separate brains if your corpus callosum is cut. However, most of us don't have a cut corpus callosum, so activity is able to be communicated from one hemisphere to the other and vice versa. On the right side of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere of the brain, and the left side of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere of the brain. So make sure you know, oh, this is going to be opposite for you. Right controls left, left controls right. Makes an X. Okay, let's talk about it. Right hemisphere, left hemisphere. What are we doing here? Okay, so all of these things, you're going to see like main keywords right down the middle of the brain, but some of the stuff that happens on the right hemisphere might be different in the left hemisphere, even though we're dealing with the same thing. So let's look at the first example, vision. Now, left and your right hemispheres are going to do different things when we're processing our vision. So in the left hemisphere, this is what allows us to see words and letters. Okay, on the right hemisphere, this is what allows us to see and process geometric patterns, faces, and emotional expressions. So your ability to read the words on the screen right now, your left hemisphere is helping you out. Your ability to see the shape of the brain, the shape of the little circle that I'm talking in, that's coming from the right hemisphere of your brain. Hearing. So from the left hemisphere, we're going to hear language sounds. So like words, any sort of sound that comes from a language. And then right hemisphere is going to be non-language sounds like music or other things like that. Memory. So for the left hemisphere, we have our verbal memory. And then right hemisphere, we have our non-verbal memory. So talking about things, conversations, interactions, that can be verbal memory as opposed to the right hemisphere, which might be like something that you've read or something that you watched, but no words were taking place. Language. Okay, so left hemisphere, we have our speech, and that is comprehension and also our ability to speak, because we just learned about those 2 association areas. Grammar rules, reading, writing, arithmetic. All of that's going to happen in the left hemisphere. Now, you being able to pick up on emotional tone of speech, so someone's angry tone, sad tone, happy tone, excited tone, all of that is going to come from the right hemisphere. Okay, spatial ability. Trying to figure out where I can move my little face. Spatial ability, right hemisphere. We've got our geometry, which we can see that kind of makes sense because down in vision, on the right hemisphere, we were also able to pick up our geometric patterns there. But any sort of sense of direction, distance, geometry, rotation of shapes, all of that's going to come from right hemisphere. A lot of spatial things are going to happen in our right hemisphere. So all of spatial ability is going to happen in that right hemisphere. Okay, brain plasticity. This is a really cool thing. This just means your brain is able to change and almost heal itself. So sometimes you'll see it as neuroplasticity, but this is just the brain's ability to continuously change throughout one's life due to its use. So basically, if you are using your brain, it's changing the parts of your brain that you don't use, you lose it, right? It's constantly kind of clearing out old neural pathways that you don't use anymore and creating new ones. Also, it's clearing out old memories. So this is why you probably can't really remember a lot of stuff that happened when you were like 6 or 7 or 8, but you can remember a lot more of what's happening now. The brain is clearing things out. It's constantly kind of binging the stuff that you don't use anymore. And again, like I said, this is almost like it heals itself as well. So sometimes brain activity associated with a certain function can be transferred to a different area, specifically if that original area is damaged. So like we saw in the Secrets of the Mind video, for the phantom limb syndrome, remember that part of his brain that was in control of feeling sensations on his hand? Well, that's not in use anymore because he doesn't have that hand. So the brain actually took over that part on the sensory cortex and allowed for more sensation on his face. So your brain tries to kind of heal itself and adapt if there's damage or neural networks that you don't use anymore. So this is really cool. It's really awesome that your brain is able to do this. Okay, so split brain procedure. So like I was talking about before, if you needed to split that corpus callosum, you could do that and still function. And they actually look at people who have had that corpus callosum cut, so their hemispheres act independently of each other. And we've learned a lot of things from split brain patients. We can see what's unique about them now that their hemispheres can't communicate back and forth with each other. So a lot of times the corpus callosum will be cut if someone has severe cases of epilepsy, so they have really, really intense seizures. But there are side effects to that, so we can see and observe what are the consequences of this? What can and can't they do if that corpus callosum is cut? So I actually have a really cool video to show y'all when we meet in class together again after you've watched this video and you take notes. And they're going to take a guy who's had his corpus callosum cut, and they're going to put him through some tests. And as he does the tests, we are going to do them also. And we're going to see who has a harder time doing the tasks. Is there something that he can do that we can't do? Or is there something that we can do that he can't do? So it gets really, really interesting. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more. Okay, so in order to understand what someone can and can't do, when their hemispheres are separated, we just have to remember what the different hemispheres do and the fact that the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. So specifically, we want to look at and remember, where is speech and language located? We know that that's located in the left hemisphere, which we know controls the right side of the body. So let's take a couple examples here. So if Sally is a split brain patient, so her corpus callosum is cut, those hemispheres are not able to interact with each other, and she sees a baseball in her right visual field, where does that go in her brain? So if she sees a baseball in her right visual field, so through her right eye, that information gets sent to, you guessed it, the left hemisphere, because the left side controls the right side of the body. Now, can she say that she sees the baseball in her right field of vision? Well, think about where are those language areas located? They're located in the left hemisphere. And that information from the right side of the body gets sent to the left hemisphere. So yeah, if she sees that baseball from her right eye or her right field of vision, she can say she sees that baseball because language is in the left hemisphere. Now, this is where it gets a little crazy. If she holds the baseball in her left hand, and we know that the left side of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere, can she say she is holding a baseball? No, because the right brain The right brain will receive that information. Like, it'll be aware that there's a baseball in her hand because of the spatial awareness and the geometry that that right hemisphere picks up on, but she can't say it because she doesn't have any neurons to take that information from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere because her corpus callosum is cut. So she could potentially hold a baseball in her left hand and not be able to tell anyone that she has a baseball in her left hand because language is in the left hemisphere. Crazy. Think about it. So let me know if you have any questions. Next time I see you, we'll review some of these different parts. We will have some questions. We'll take some quizzes. We'll assess our knowledge. And we will continue to learn more about the brain parts. Hopefully you filled out your notes.